Hello, welcome to this week's episode of the Academy. We're going to continue on Sun Tzu's Art of War in Chapter 10, Part 3. We're kind of finish up the study about the 6 kinds of terrain. And this will be relatively clear. It's kind of an easy topic, these last 2 points. But I want to go through a couple comments about actually reading commentators and how to be careful as you do read through things like this and you take advantage of commentators' insights. You also have to be on guard for some biases. So let's get started. Again, I was going to repeat sentence 1 so we remember what we're dealing with, and then we're going to do sentences 10 through 13. Okay. Sun Tzu said, "We may distinguish 6 kinds of terrain, to wit, 1. Accessible ground, 2. Entangling ground, 3. Temporizing ground, 4. Narrow passes, 5. Precipitous heights, 6. Positions at a great distance from the enemy." Okay, so on to 10. With regard to precipitous heights, if you are beforehand with your adversary, you should occupy the raised and sunny spots, and there wait for him to come. If the enemy has occupied them before you, do not follow him, but retreat and try to entice him away. If you are situated at a great distance from your enemy, and the strength of the 2 armies is equal, it is not easy to provoke a battle, and fighting will be to your disadvantage. These 6 are the principles connected with earth. The general who has attained a responsible post must be careful to study them. Alright, well, these last 2 are actually fairly simple to cover. The precipitous heights concept here, with regard to it, the idea is to get there first and take that ground. Now, in this particular sense that he's using it here, you want to take the sunny high spots. You're basically avoiding areas where you might be low and boggy ground, which would obviously make maneuvering kind of hard. So you want your enemies to be in that position, right? The sunny high ground is a little more stable. You can move your forces around a lot more efficiently. But let's look at just elevation on the battlefield in general. Now we're talking about not just, 1 story difference. We're talking multiple stories. So, figure 6-8 inches above the ground level. So the idea here is basically don't go after him, and try to chase him down to get at that. Now if it's a melee type army and you've got this type of situation, you don't pursue and try to take the hill, so to speak. In some game systems, elevation matters when you're shooting even. In those cases, again, be very careful. You don't want to engage in, take the hill, so to speak. What you want to try to do is entice your opponent off that hill so that you can more or less deal with them on even footing. Right? So I'm going to butcher this name. I really do apologize for any of those who know Chinese names. Cao Kung says, "The particular advantage of securing heights and defiles is what your actions cannot then be dictated by your enemy." Is that your actions can't then be dictated by the enemy. If you think about it, if you have a commanding position, you actually have influence over your opponent's movements. You have a clear line of fire to certain areas. They'll be less likely to move certain units in that space. Especially if you got a clearer field of fire, they will be less likely to use that area. Had you been a little bit lower, maybe there's some blocking terrain, they would have been able to sneak up behind that and use that as cover. So this is really extremely important to secure that height, but don't chase after the opponent if they're there. You want to try to entice them down. Make it possible, or make it pointless for them to have that height. Again, you have to look at the entire battlefield here. There will be areas that are high and areas that are low. Hopefully there's not just one precipitous height on that battlefield. Hopefully there are some actually that you'll be able to take advantage of. You want to make sure that you deny your opponent the benefit by keeping units basically out of the line of sight, out of weapon range. So it really doesn't benefit him much. Give him reason to basically abandon the position, again using bait that we talked about in the previous chapters. But you don't want to just kind of rush forward and try to take him. As long as he's in that commanding position, there is a danger. Okay. Now, the next set idea, or the next terrain type, is great distance. Now, this one's actually pretty important on the smaller scale games. So you're talking 6mm, 8mm, 15mm, where you have large tables and you have a lot of distance that you have to cover maybe during a game. This actually does play more into those games than the smaller tabletop games. But always consider this. Okay, the key to this particular terrain type, is from a conceptual perspective, isn't anything more than when there's a large distance between you and the enemy, where neither of you can project your force, your combat capacity, onto the opponent because the distances are too great, you have no real effect on the enemy. You have no effect on the battle, right? At that point, it's a race to secure advantageous ground. Okay, so think about what you're going to want to do when you're faced with this on these tabletops. Think of a combat patrol mission, 400 points, very minimal units, not a lot of vehicles on that type of a terrain a game. So a lot of foot slogging, but it's still a 4-foot by 6-foot table. Think of Flames of War, large tables, still small units, good distances. There are going to be times when some of your units are not going to be in a position to actually affect the battle, to engage the opponent. Now, hopefully, it's to your advantage because you are actually laying in wait for them, be it an ambush or a defensive line, of anti-tank, for example, or whatever, something, a bulwark upon which you're hoping that they're gonna run into. However, remember that as long as your opponent is outside of your effective range, you can't influence them as well. Now, you can still try to do some bait maneuvers to kind of give them some likely targets, juicy things to go after, but you really can't force their hand. You can't turn them away. You can't pin them down because you're just not within range. You're out of range to influence, right? So in order to do it, you have to move. So you're going to want to move quickly. Now, some game systems have rules that reflect disorder that comes with moving too quickly. There's a huge number of game systems out there, and all different from all different years. Some have these rules. A lot of ones now at tabletop don't. But if they're there, you have to be careful to keep track of those impacts of moving quickly. What does it mean to run, or to move flat out, or to do a double march, or whatever terms that the game has, compared to just advancing and taking the rest of your turn? Think about it, because you have to consider the fact that if you are outside of their influence range and they're outside of yours, you can't. That extra distance actually gives your opponent time to prepare for your move. So you may be preparing your move, you may be maneuvering to gain a position, but because you're not in range to actually influence them and put some stress on them, they'll be able to freely respond and maybe counter your move. Much like in chess, you have one move per side. You can often make a counter move that really does it nullifies or minimizes the importance of what the opponent just did. So again, on tabletop, it's the same thing. It's harder to create an advantage if you aren't within range. So at a great distance, make sure you don't commit too quickly. Make sure you don't waste time out there, because every move you make, your opponent has a chance to counter. So you need to be careful about the timing of getting in there to force your will on the opponent. Which means close the distance. Now, here's one of the interesting things, though. And this is the concept that it kind of came startlingly to me as I read through this. My particular commentator kind of had what I think is pretty insulting reference at one point, and I think he missed the point. So when you read through commentators' opinions of the material, be very, very careful to watch out for different biases. Because as I read through these first, without his input, I just read this chapter and then went back to look at him and what he said. I had come to some conclusions that he did not. Okay, and I realized that I think he may have missed a point. So here's a quote, I think, right out of right out of the book, right out of my particular commentator's mouth or pen, it's hardly necessary to point out the faultiness of this classification, 4, 5, and 6 there. A strange lack of logical perception is shown by the Chinaman's unquestioning acceptance of glaring cross divisions such as the above. So he's essentially dismissing what Sun Tzu is saying simply because these concepts, all 6 terrain types, seem to mix a little bit. You can have precipitous heights that are entangling ground. You can have narrow passes and precipitous heights. You can have positions of great distance and no accessible ground. All these things mix and match. And that is entirely true, but it doesn't actually take away anything from what Sun Tzu says. In fact, it amplifies it. So careful as you listen to the commentators or read the commentators. Watch for any time where they might dismiss something, and be very careful not to fall into that same trap. Be aware when there's a debate about a particular perspective, what was meant. You're going to have to make up your own mind there, which to believe, what makes most sense. But when you're looking at it and trying to see, your commentator seems to dismiss it, don't dismiss it with them, okay? Because here, in this particular case, there are 6 types of terrain, and yes, there's combinations. What that means is that for each of those combinations, you have to take into account the impacts of each of the terrain types, and they'll stack. So, for example, entangling ground is ground where it's going to be hard to take back once you leave it. Well, if that's precipitous heights as well, you definitely do not want to leave it. And your opponent, it's extremely important. If your opponent has that, it's doubly important that you make him leave it, because it'll be much harder for him to regain that. All right. Positions of great distance, same thing. If you get the precipitous heights, but you're too far away to influence your enemy, it doesn't matter much. Your opponent can react to you and maybe even counter the advantage of the precipitous heights. So as we go back through, again, looking at accessible ground, entangling ground, temporizing ground, narrow passes, precipitous heights, and positions of great distance from the enemy, looking at all 6 types, look at what you should and shouldn't do in each situation, and then if there's a multiplication, a combination of those terrain types, all the do's and don'ts apply additively. So keep that in mind as you plan out and look at the tabletop and how you should move about or not on a particular terrain-strewn battle. All right? So that's my advice for this particular week on Chapter 3. Chapter 4, we're going to start looking at the 6 calamities. This will be kind of a fun part of the series. All right? Hope you learned something. Comment below, share, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.